The morning began like any other for the FBI director. He woke up early before the sun had fully risen and made himself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, giving him a rare moment to reflect on the responsibilities that had followed him for years. As he sipped his coffee, he reviewed the schedule for the day. There were meetings with local officials, briefings on ongoing operations, and a short drive through the city to inspect one of the Bureau's field offices. He left his home in a black SUV, accompanied by a small security detail. The streets were just starting to fill with traffic, the hum of early morning life echoing in the city. Despite the calm beginning, he felt a strange sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. It was subtle, almost like a whisper in the back of his mind telling him to stay alert. The drive was smooth at first. He waved to a few familiar faces on the street, people who had recognized him, and they nodded in respect. Everything seemed normal until he approached a narrow road lined with local businesses. A police car was parked at the side, lights flashing, signaling for him to pull over. At first, he thought it was a routine traffic stop. He carefully guided his vehicle to the side, rolling down the window as the officer approached. The officer, a tall man with a stern expression, nodded curtly before speaking. "Good morning, sir. Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked. The director responded politely, explaining that he had not noticed any traffic violations and was complying fully with the law. The officer's gaze lingered on him, sharp and probing. There was something in his tone, a subtle weight that suggested this was no ordinary stop. The days after the initial traffic stop were tense. The FBI director moved carefully through the city, aware that every glance, every approach could be another subtle threat. He had documented every detail, shared them with trusted members of his inner team, and ensured that his security was tightened, but the unease persisted. The encounter had left a mark, a reminder that power could attract corruption in the most unexpected ways. Each morning, he reviewed reports and prepared for meetings, all while mentally replaying the interaction. The officer's words echoed in his mind, the casual suggestion that compliance alone might not be enough, that understanding and cooperation in unusual ways could be expected. The director understood the gravity. Local law enforcement was attempting to assert influence over a federal leader. He decided that a careful strategy was necessary. Any direct confrontation could escalate tensions or create public exposure that might compromise both his position and the Bureau's operations. So he began gathering more information, studying the officers' behavior and patterns, noting subtle signs of connections, possible accomplices and weaknesses in their approach. It was detective work in its purest sense, but with the added challenge of managing political and legal sensitivities. One afternoon, he arranged a discreet meeting with his deputy and a senior internal investigator. They went over the documented notes from the traffic stop, discussing the tone, timing, and implications. The conversation was careful, methodical, and focused on maintaining professional discretion. The director emphasized that they could not act impulsively, but needed to prepare a clear path forward to address the extortion attempt without jeopardizing safety or reputation. At the same time, he began attending public engagements and meetings in the city, maintaining his usual professionalism. He met with local law enforcement, city officials, and community leaders. Every interaction was polite and measured, yet beneath the surface, he was assessing reactions, noting any sign of unusual behavior or undue interest. He could see how subtle pressure could be applied by those who believed their authority extended beyond proper limits. The officer, emboldened by the initial encounter, made occasional appearances near the director's movements, always polite but pointed. Each gesture and comment seemed to remind the director that they had power in ways he had not yet fully mapped. The extortion attempt was not overt. It was psychological, built on intimidation, ambiguity, and the expectation of compliance. The director recognized this tactic immediately, a form of manipulation designed to test boundaries. In private, he briefed his security team on maintaining distance, observing behaviors, and documenting interactions. They worked quietly, carefully, with an awareness that public scrutiny could complicate their actions. The director was aware of the delicate balance. Any misstep could turn the situation into a scandal or provoke retaliation, which he wanted to avoid. Meanwhile, news of minor controversies in the city created distractions. The local media reported on various incidents unrelated to him, yet he observed how information could be framed and manipulated. He understood the power of perception and the importance of managing not only the facts but also the narrative. This awareness was crucial in planning how to respond to the subtle extortion attempt. The pressure from the officer grew incrementally. Occasionally, he received notes or brief messages through unofficial channels, implying consequences if he did not show understanding or cooperation. The director treated each carefully, never responding emotionally but documenting every instance meticulously. The psychological toll was significant, yet he remained composed. He knew that integrity and patience were essential in navigating such challenges. The morning after arranging the formal review, the FBI director woke with a clear sense of purpose. The previous days had been tense, filled with careful observation, documentation, and strategy. But today was about resolution. The city outside was waking slowly, sunlight spilling over the streets, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe in the ordinary rhythm of life. The calmness was brief. The weight of responsibility returned quickly as he considered the upcoming confrontation. He reviewed the compiled evidence once more. Notes from the initial stop, subsequent interactions, subtle messages from the officer, and behavioral observations were meticulously organized. Every detail mattered. He understood that confronting corruption required patience, clarity, and a calm authority that left no room for misinterpretation. His goal was not humiliation but accountability, ensuring that justice and the integrity of law enforcement were upheld. Arriving at the controlled meeting site, the day of formal disciplinary action began with a quiet anticipation. The FBI director arrived at the headquarters early, the city streets still shrouded in the calm of morning. The air felt crisp and sharp, carrying with it the weight of responsibility and the sense that today would mark a turning point. He moved through the corridors with measured steps, his team close but unobtrusive, ensuring that the process would unfold smoothly and with dignity. The officers involved had been instructed to report for formal proceedings. They arrived with visible tension, their earlier confidence replaced by nervousness and uncertainty. The director observed them carefully, noting their body language, hesitation, and the subtle signs of growing panic. The weight of accountability was beginning to press upon them, and the calm authority of the director magnified the gravity of the situation. Inside the meeting room, the director began by laying out the context of the investigation. He spoke clearly, calmly, and with an unwavering tone, outlining the events leading from the initial traffic stop to the subsequent attempts at intimidation and extortion. Every detail was presented logically, supported by documentation, witness statements, and recorded observations. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. The officers initially tried to maintain composure, attempting to argue that there had been misunderstandings. But the director was prepared. He addressed each claim patiently, presenting facts, timelines, and the implications of each action. As he spoke, the officer's initial bravado eroded, replaced by visible signs of fear and regret. The reality of their misconduct was undeniable, and the consequences were now clear. He emphasized the human element, reminding them that law enforcement is a profession built on trust, integrity, and ethical responsibility. Every choice we make, he said, affects not only ourselves but also the people we serve and the institution we represent. Misusing authority for personal gain undermines everything we stand for. His words were firm but not harsh, aiming to instill understanding rather than provoke further resistance. The morning of the final stage began quietly, with the FBI director reflecting on the journey so far. The previous confrontations, investigations, and disciplinary actions had created a clear path toward resolution. Today, the focus was on ensuring that the lessons learned were cemented, accountability fully established, and the officers involved understood the human and professional consequences of their actions. As he arrived at the headquarters, the city outside seemed ordinary, but the atmosphere within was charged with the weight of finality. His team had prepared meticulously, ensuring that all documentation, evidence, and procedures were ready for the day's proceedings. The director moved with calm assurance, fully aware that his composure and clarity would shape not only the immediate outcome, but the long-term lessons for the institution. The officers arrived, visibly tense and subdued. They had been through the formal disciplinary process already, and the weight of accountability was pressing heavily on them. Their previous arrogance had been replaced by a tentative understanding of the gravity of their misconduct. The director observed carefully, noting subtle shifts in posture, tone, and eye contact, signs that the lessons of the past days were beginning to resonate. The meeting began with the director reviewing the events chronologically. He outlined the initial stop, the subsequent attempts at subtle manipulation, the meetings, and the investigations. Each step was presented calmly, clearly, and factually. The officers listened in silence, aware that each point underscored the seriousness of their actions and the undeniable evidence against them. He then shifted to a broader perspective, discussing the responsibilities of law enforcement, the ethical obligations that come with authority, and the impact of misconduct on public trust. Our power is not just a position or a privilege, he said, his tone steady and deliberate. It carries responsibility to act fairly, honestly, and with integrity. Misusing that power harms not just ourselves but the people we are sworn to protect. The words were not accusatory but instructive, aimed at fostering understanding and reflection. The officers responded with hesitance, some offering brief acknowledgments or apologies. The director listened carefully, allowing space for them to confront their own actions and the reality of the consequences. He emphasized that recognition and acknowledgement were important, but accountability required concrete steps, including behavioral correction, professional oversight, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. Throughout the day, the director maintained a balance between firmness and empathy. He understood that the officers were human, prone to error, and capable of learning from their mistakes. The goal was not only to enforce consequences, but to guide them toward understanding the seriousness of their actions and the principles they had violated. Internal investigators and legal advisors were present, documenting every interaction, statement, and admission. The process was meticulous, ensuring that all actions were fully supported by evidence and aligned with policy. The director's calm authority set the tone, reinforcing the importance of integrity, clarity, and ethical leadership in every decision. As the proceedings continued, the officers' initial panic evolved into genuine reflection. They began to articulate their understanding of how their behavior had crossed ethical boundaries, acknowledging the potential harm to the institution and the public. The director listened attentively, providing guidance and reinforcing the principles of accountability, integrity, and professional responsibility. The final phase involved outlining corrective measures. The officers were assigned additional training, mentorship, and structured oversight to ensure that such misconduct would not recur. The disciplinary measures were clear, fair, and focused on both accountability and education. The director emphasized that the objective was not merely punishment, but the restoration of trust, the reinforcement of ethical conduct, and the prevention of future lapses. Throughout the day, the director maintained routine operations alongside the proceedings. He visited field offices, reviewed reports, and engaged with staff, ensuring that normal work continued seamlessly. The balance of addressing misconduct while maintaining operational focus highlighted the importance of leadership that is both principled and practical. By late afternoon, the formal proceedings concluded. The officers, now fully aware of the consequences of their actions, had undergone a process that combined accountability, ethical instruction, and professional guidance. The director conducted a final debrief with his team, reviewing the outcomes, the lessons learned, and the steps for ongoing monitoring and support. After leaving the headquarters, he took a moment to reflect. The situation had begun with a subtle act of manipulation and had escalated into a comprehensive lesson on power, ethics, and human behavior. The officers had experienced the consequences of misuse of authority. The Bureau's integrity had been preserved, and the principles of leadership had been reinforced. In the evening, he sat in quiet contemplation. He thought about the journey, the challenges, and the human dynamics that had played out over the past weeks. The incident had tested not only professional skills but also patience, judgment, and ethical clarity. By maintaining composure, adherence to principle, and a human-centered approach, he had navigated a complex situation successfully. He also reflected on the broader lessons for law enforcement and leadership. Power, when misused, attracts consequences. Ethical lapses can have wide-reaching impacts, but principled guidance, accountability, and calm leadership can restore balance and foster learning. The officers involved had been confronted with reality, but the process also provided an opportunity for growth and reflection. The city outside continued its usual rhythm, oblivious to the subtle drama that had unfolded. Yet within the walls of the Bureau, a clear message had been established. Integrity, accountability, and ethical leadership are non-negotiable. The director had demonstrated that patience, strategic thinking, and principled action could transform potential crises into lessons that strengthened both individuals and institutions. As he prepared for rest, he felt a sense of resolution. The officers had faced the consequences of their actions, the Bureau's integrity was intact, and the lessons of accountability and ethical leadership had been firmly established. The experience had been challenging, yet it reinforced the values that guide law enforcement: fairness, responsibility, and the courage to act with integrity in the face of manipulation or corruption. The director understood that challenges would continue to arise in unexpected forms, yet he was confident that the foundation of principle, patience, and moral clarity demonstrated through this process would guide him and his team through future trials. The lessons learned would resonate within the Bureau for years, reinforcing the importance of leadership that is ethical, strategic, and human-centered. The night ended with a quiet sense of accomplishment and reflection. A dangerous and manipulative situation had been navigated with integrity and composure. Accountability had been established, ethical lessons reinforced, and the human elements of leadership acknowledged. The director knew that the principles of justice, responsibility, and ethical authority would continue to guide him and the institution he led, ensuring that the lessons of this episode would endure and strengthen the fabric of law enforcement for the future. Throughout the proceedings, the director maintained a balanced approach. He was aware that public perception, legal protocol, and internal morale all depended on how the situation was handled. There was no need for theatrics or personal vindication. The focus was on accountability, correction, and restoring the integrity of the office and the Bureau. As the officers began to acknowledge their misconduct, their panic deepened. They realized that the attempt to manipulate a federal authority had failed, and now they were exposed to serious professional consequences. Their pleas for leniency began, hesitant and faltering as they grasped the full scope of their actions. The director listened carefully, but he did not let emotion sway the process. Accountability was paramount. Internal investigators documented the meeting meticulously, capturing every admission, hesitation, and statement. The director used this as an opportunity to teach, emphasizing that ethical behavior and responsibility were not optional, but fundamental to law enforcement. The officers began to understand that their actions had not only legal repercussions but moral and professional ones as well. After hours of careful discussion, the formal disciplinary measures were determined. The officers were suspended, their actions formally recorded, and a plan for rehabilitation and retraining was outlined. The process was thorough, fair, and structured, designed to reinforce the principles of accountability and ethical conduct. The director ensured that the outcome balanced justice with the opportunity for reflection and growth. Following the meeting, the director debriefed his internal team. He reviewed the proceedings, the officers' reactions, and the documented evidence. He highlighted the importance of maintaining composure, strategic planning, and ethical clarity in handling sensitive situations. The lessons learned would be applied to future leadership challenges, reinforcing the Bureau's standards and values. Outside the meeting room, word of the disciplinary action began to circulate quietly within the department. The officers' panic was evident to those who knew the details, and the contrast between their earlier arrogance and current vulnerability was striking. The director remained focused on his responsibilities, continuing routine operations and ensuring that the Bureau's work was uninterrupted by the internal drama. That evening, he reflected on the events of the day. The situation had tested his patience, judgment, and leadership. By remaining calm, principled, and focused on accountability, he had navigated a complex ethical and professional challenge successfully. The officers had faced the consequences of their actions, and the integrity of the Bureau had been upheld. He understood that leadership was not about exerting power for personal gain, but about guiding, correcting, and protecting the values of the institution. He also considered the human lessons. Fear, ambition, and ethical lapses had driven the officer's misconduct. By addressing the situation with fairness and clarity, he provided an opportunity for reflection and potential growth. The process highlighted the importance of understanding human behavior, maintaining ethical standards, and using authority responsibly. Throughout the evening, he prepared notes and reflections on the proceedings. These notes would serve as a reference for future cases, a guide for leadership decisions, and a reminder of the importance of integrity in positions of power. He wrote not only about the officer's actions but also about the strategies, principles, and ethical considerations that guided his response. As night fell, he allowed himself a moment of quiet contemplation. The city outside was alive, lights flickering and cars moving steadily. Yet within the walls of the bureau, the drama of accountability had unfolded. The officers who had attempted extortion were now confronted with reality, and the director had successfully transformed a moment of potential crisis into a demonstration of principled leadership. He reflected on the broader implications of the incident. Power could attract corruption, but it also offered the opportunity to teach, guide, and correct. Ethical leadership required patience, composure, and strategic insight. By maintaining these qualities, he had ensured that justice was served, integrity was preserved, and the lessons of accountability were clearly demonstrated. The night ended with a sense of resolution. The officers had faced the consequences of their actions, the Bureau's integrity was intact, and the director had reinforced the principles of ethical leadership. The process had been challenging, requiring careful balance, human understanding, and unwavering commitment to justice. In his quiet study, he reviewed the day one final time. The officers' panic, regret, and acknowledgement of misconduct underscored the importance of ethical guidance and principled leadership. He had turned a dangerous and manipulative situation into an opportunity for accountability, reflection, and learning. He knew that the lessons of the day would resonate long after the immediate proceedings were over. The importance of integrity, the consequences of misused authority, and the value of calm, principled action had been clearly demonstrated. Leadership, he realized, was not measured solely by authority or title, but by the ability to navigate complex human dynamics with fairness, wisdom, and ethical clarity. As he prepared for rest, he felt a sense of accomplishment tempered by humility. The challenge had been met with integrity, and the principles of justice had prevailed. The officers had been held accountable, the institution had been protected, and the human lessons of ethical responsibility had been reinforced. The director knew that leadership would continue to be tested in unforeseen ways, but the foundation of principle, patience, and moral clarity he had demonstrated today would guide him through future challenges with confidence and purpose. He noted the presence of internal investigators and security personnel. The setup was deliberate, neutral, professional, and secure. The officers involved were instructed to attend, unaware of the full weight of the evidence against them. The director knew that the manner of confrontation could determine whether the situation escalated or resolved with dignity. As the officers entered, there was a mixture of arrogance and uncertainty in their demeanor. The initial attempt at extortion had emboldened them, but subtle cracks in their confidence were now visible. They tried to maintain composure, but the director's calm, unwavering presence immediately set the tone. He did not raise his voice, make threats, or display anger. Instead, he exuded authority rooted in knowledge, preparation, and ethical clarity. He began the meeting by acknowledging the officers professionally, then outlined the purpose to clarify their actions, assess accountability, and ensure the principles of law were respected. He allowed them to speak, listening carefully to each word, watching for inconsistencies, evasions, or attempts to deflect responsibility. His observations were keen, noting subtle cues in tone, body language, and phrasing. The officers initially attempted to downplay their behavior, suggesting misunderstandings or exaggerations. Their words were careful, but the weight of evidence was undeniable. The director calmly presented each piece of documentation, referencing notes from the traffic stop, subsequent communications, and observed patterns of behavior. Each fact was laid out clearly, methodically, without judgment or emotion, allowing the officers to confront reality. As the meeting progressed, the psychological balance shifted. The initial confidence of the officers began to waver. They realized that their previous attempts at manipulation had failed, and that they were now facing professional scrutiny with tangible evidence against them. Panic began to replace arrogance, subtle signs of anxiety appearing in posture, eye contact, and tone. The director maintained calm authority, emphasizing accountability rather than punishment. He explained the implications of their actions, legal consequences, professional ramifications, and the moral weight of violating trust and authority. The officers listened, their previous bravado diminished, understanding for the first time the seriousness of the misconduct. He also addressed the human side of leadership and law enforcement. "Power is a responsibility," he said, his tone steady but earnest. "It is not meant to be leveraged for personal gain, intimidation, or manipulation. Every action carries consequences, not just for the individual, but for the institution, colleagues, and the public we serve." His words were direct, but not harsh. They highlighted ethical responsibility and personal reflection, creating space for understanding and acknowledgement. Throughout the discussion, the director remained focused on outcomes that would restore integrity and ensure accountability. He was not interested in retribution or spectacle. His goal was to correct behavior, demonstrate consequences, and uphold trust in law enforcement. The officers, confronted with the reality of their actions, began to respond with humility, acknowledging errors and expressing concern about the potential fallout. The internal investigators carefully documented the proceedings, noting each acknowledgement, hesitation, and admission. The director's calm composure reinforced the gravity of the situation. By remaining principled and patient, he shifted the dynamic from confrontation to reflection, allowing the officers to recognize their misconduct and the importance of rectifying it. After the meeting, the director convened with his team to plan the next steps. Formal disciplinary action would be necessary, but the approach needed to balance justice, legal protocol, and ethical guidance. They reviewed all notes, evidence, and observed behaviors, ensuring that every action taken would be clear, fair, and enforceable. He spent the afternoon visiting the field office, engaging with staff, and maintaining routine oversight of operations. Externally, everything appeared normal. Internally, he remained vigilant, aware that the resolution of the extortion attempt would influence morale, perception, and the future behavior of others in the department. Leadership required visibility, consistency, and integrity, and he ensured these principles were upheld. That evening, he returned to his temporary residence and reviewed the psychological dynamics of the day. The officer's panic, subtle and growing, indicated the effectiveness of a measured, evidence-based approach. By combining authority with patience and ethical clarity, he had shifted the balance of power from coercion to accountability. He reflected on the broader lessons of the encounter. Power, when misused, attracts risk and consequences. Attempting to manipulate or extort those who uphold the law only magnifies exposure and failure. Conversely, principled leadership, patience, and calm assertiveness can restore balance, correct misconduct, and reinforce institutional integrity. These were not abstract concepts but practical truths, evident in the officer's reactions and the structured process of accountability. As night fell, he sat quietly in his study, documenting insights, reactions, and reflections from the day. He prepared notes for the formal report, ensuring that all evidence, admissions, and observed behaviors were accurately recorded. Accuracy and clarity were essential. They formed the foundation for a resolution that would uphold law, ethics, and justice. He also considered the human side of the officer's behavior. Fear, ambition, misunderstanding, and ethical lapses had driven their actions. While misconduct could not be excused, understanding the human factors was crucial in guiding them toward acknowledgement, accountability, and correction. He planned to address these factors in formal proceedings, ensuring that lessons were learned and repeated misconduct prevented. Throughout the night, he reflected on his own role in the process. Maintaining composure under pressure, balancing authority with empathy, and addressing ethical violations without personal bias were not easy tasks. Yet they were essential to preserving integrity, trust, and leadership credibility. Each decision, each interaction, had consequences for the institution, the individuals involved, and the public they served. By the end of the evening, he felt a sense of measured accomplishment. The confrontation had not only established accountability, but also reinforced the principles of ethical leadership and the importance of evidence-based action. The officers, now aware of the gravity of their actions, faced the reality of consequences, and the director had successfully navigated a complex situation with integrity, patience, and human-centered leadership. He prepared for the next day, knowing that formal disciplinary measures would proceed and public exposure might follow. Yet he remained focused on the core lesson. Power must be exercised responsibly, misconduct must be addressed with clarity and fairness, and integrity must guide every decision. The city outside was quiet, unaware of the subtle drama that had unfolded. Yet the impact would resonate for years within the walls of law enforcement and the Bureau. In the quiet of the night, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The extortion attempt had been a test not of his authority alone, but of patience, ethics, and strategic thinking. By remaining calm, principled, and focused on accountability, he had transformed a dangerous and manipulative situation into a demonstration of justice, leadership, and the human responsibility that accompanies power. One evening, after a long day of meetings and observation, the director sat in his study reviewing all collected information. He traced timelines, patterns, and possible motivations. His goal was not revenge, but accountability. He knew that addressing the situation required evidence, strategy, and calm authority. Acting prematurely could embolden the officers further or create public complications. He also began reflecting on the human side of the situation. The officers attempting to exert influence were not faceless entities. They were individuals with ambitions, fears, and flaws. Understanding their mindset could be key in resolving the matter. He realized that empathy, combined with firm boundaries and accountability, could diffuse tension while upholding justice. During this period, the director maintained his routine as much as possible. He visited the field office, reviewed case files, and interacted with his staff, projecting calm authority. To outsiders, everything appeared normal, yet he was constantly alert, reading body language, tone, and small details for signs of potential interference. He had learned in his career that the smallest hints often revealed the largest truths. As the days passed, he noticed small changes in the officer's behavior. There were hesitations, subtle signs of unease, and inconsistencies in explanations given to peers. The director began piecing together a clearer understanding of the officer's intentions, connections, and vulnerabilities. This information would be crucial in confronting the extortion attempt with confidence and authority. One afternoon, he scheduled a private meeting with the officer in a controlled environment, arranged with internal oversight and security measures. The purpose was clear: to assess their intentions, understand their reasoning, and determine the next steps. The director approached the meeting with calm authority, aware that the psychological impact of his composure could influence the outcome as much as the facts themselves. During the meeting, the officer attempted to assert dominance subtly, reminding the director of the previous stop and implying expectations. The director listened carefully, maintaining neutral expressions, and allowed the officer to speak fully without interruption. Then, calmly and firmly, he outlined the legal and ethical boundaries, the evidence collected, and the potential consequences of misconduct. The words were deliberate, measured, and authoritative. For a moment, the officer seemed taken aback. The realization of exposure and accountability began to sink in. The subtle confidence that had guided the extortion attempt began to waver. The director's calm yet firm approach demonstrated control, understanding, and unwavering commitment to law and principle. The psychological balance shifted, highlighting the contrast between ethical authority and unethical intimidation. After the meeting, the director debriefed his internal team thoroughly. Every nuance, reaction, and statement was documented. Plans for formal investigation were drafted, ensuring that accountability could be enforced without unnecessary exposure or escalation. The director understood that his role was not only to protect himself, but to uphold the integrity of the Bureau and the law. That evening, he reflected on the events and their implications. The officer's audacity, subtle threats, and attempts at manipulation were unsettling, but they also reinforced the importance of vigilance, patience, and moral clarity. He realized that power and authority could be challenged in unexpected ways, and handling such challenges required more than force or position. It required wisdom, restraint, and strategic thinking. He also considered the human impact. The officer, despite wrongdoing, was still capable of learning from the experience. The director knew that confronting the extortion attempt with fairness and firmness, rather than anger or humiliation, could lead to genuine accountability and correction. Punishment without understanding might satisfy justice in part, but guidance and clarity could prevent future misconduct. Throughout this period, the director maintained focus on his duties, ensuring that day-to-day operations continued smoothly. His staff were unaware of much of the behind-the-scenes strategy, as discretion was essential, yet his leadership style remained steady, composed, and human-centric, balancing authority with empathy and strategic insight. As the days stretched into weeks, the pressure eased slightly. The officer began to show signs of compliance, a tentative understanding of boundaries and hesitation in pursuing further attempts at extortion. The director continued to observe, document, and plan for formal resolution, aware that patience was the most powerful tool in handling such situations. Finally, after careful deliberation, he arranged for formal review and intervention by internal authorities. The evidence was clear, the timeline documented, and the approach methodical. The officers involved were confronted with facts, legal implications, and the moral weight of their actions. Panic replaced arrogance as they realized the severity of their misconduct and the impossibility of leveraging the director's position for personal gain. The director had successfully navigated the initial phase of the extortion attempt, maintaining integrity, authority, and human-centered leadership. He had turned an unsettling situation into an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of ethical conduct, patience, and strategic foresight. The lesson was clear. Power may attract corruption, but calm, principled action can restore balance, hold wrongdoers accountable, and protect the values upon which justice depends. That night, as he sat quietly in his study, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The encounter had tested him not through violence or direct threat, but through subtle manipulation and psychological pressure. He realized that true leadership is measured not only in success, but in the ability to maintain composure, integrity, and ethical clarity when confronted by unexpected challenges. The battle was far from over, but the foundation for accountability, justice, and resolution had been firmly established. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "I recognize who you are. I know your position. And I also know that situations like this can be complicated. Sometimes people in your role have options others do not." The words were deliberate, almost casual, but they carried an undercurrent that made the director pause. He maintained a composed expression, careful not to react. He had faced intense situations before with criminals, suspects, and dangerous negotiations, but there was something unsettling about this encounter. He could feel the subtle power play, the attempt to gauge how far he could be pushed. "Officer," he said calmly, "I am here to comply with the law, just as any citizen should. I hope we can resolve this quickly and professionally." His words were measured, his tone neutral but firm. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course, sir. But sometimes compliance alone isn't enough. Some situations require understanding. Sometimes it's better to be cooperative in ways that benefit both parties." The implication was clear, though unspoken. The director understood immediately that this was a test of his integrity and his willingness to be manipulated. He chose to remain silent for a moment, considering his response. In his mind, he weighed the consequences of confrontation against the risk of giving in to intimidation. He had built his career on fairness, integrity, and law, and he knew compromising now could have far-reaching consequences. "I understand," he replied finally, his voice steady. "I am here to follow the law and respect the process. If there is a concern, please handle it according to protocol." There was no hesitation in his words, no trace of fear, just calm authority. The officer studied him for a moment, as if measuring the truth in his words. Then unexpectedly he stepped back and gestured for the director to proceed. "Very well, sir. Continue on your way. Consider this a warning, and remember the importance of understanding in complex situations." His tone was polite, but the underlying threat lingered in the air. The director nodded and drove off, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The encounter left him unsettled. It was brief, almost insignificant in terms of time, but the psychological weight of the interaction pressed heavily on him. He realized that this was not just a traffic stop. It was a glimpse into the misuse of power, a subtle attempt at extortion masked as a routine procedure. As he continued to the bureau field office, he reflected on the officer's words. He had encountered many forms of intimidation in his career, but this was different. It was local law enforcement testing a federal leader, a delicate and dangerous game that could have serious implications if not handled correctly. At the field office, he was greeted by staff who were unaware of the incident. He maintained his usual demeanor, speaking, reviewing operations, and checking reports as if nothing had happened. Yet inside, he was already planning how to address the situation. Documentation, evidence, and a careful approach would be necessary to ensure accountability, without escalating the matter publicly. Over the next few hours, he met with local officials and law enforcement leadership, keeping the incident in mind. His experience and calm presence allowed him to navigate these interactions carefully, without raising suspicion or alarm. He noted subtle behaviors, statements, and attitudes that could indicate awareness of the earlier stop, all while maintaining professionalism. That evening, after returning to his temporary residence, he began recording notes about the encounter. Details about the officer's words, demeanor, and the timing were meticulously documented. Every nuance mattered. The director knew that future actions could depend on the accuracy of these notes, especially if the situation escalated. He also contacted trusted members of his inner team discreetly, informing them of the incident without causing unnecessary panic. The conversation was precise and controlled. He emphasized the importance of discretion, professionalism, and strategic planning. His team understood immediately the delicate nature of the encounter and the potential risks involved. As he prepared for the night, the director reviewed the day's events again in his mind. The city had appeared calm and ordinary, yet beneath the surface he could feel tension, misused authority, and subtle threats. It was a reminder that power could be abused in the smallest interactions, that even someone at the highest levels of law enforcement could be vulnerable to manipulation if not vigilant. He knew that the situation would require patience, strategy, and unwavering adherence to the law. He would need to confront the extortion attempt carefully, ensuring that justice was served without creating unnecessary conflict or danger. The encounter with the officer had been brief, almost insignificant to an outsider, but for him, it was the beginning of a challenge that tested not only his authority but his principles, judgment, and resilience. That night, as he sat in his study, he reflected on the irony of the situation. A simple traffic stop had become a window into human behavior, ambition, and greed. It reminded him that power could attract corruption, but it also provided an opportunity to demonstrate integrity, fairness, and moral strength. He knew that handling the matter correctly would require courage, patience, and careful navigation of both legal and human dynamics. He closed his notebook, took a deep breath, and looked out the window at the city below. Lights flickered in the distance, cars moved steadily along the streets, and life went on, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding. He understood that his next steps would shape not only his career, but also the principles and morale of those around him. The encounter was small in duration, but its significance was immense. In the hours before sleep, he mentally rehearsed his approach, considering every possible outcome and response. He reflected on his own strengths and weaknesses, preparing to remain calm, assertive, and ethical. He knew that any misstep could embolden those attempting extortion and complicate the situation further. By the time he lay down to rest, he felt a mixture of alertness and resolve. The city outside remained alive and bustling, yet he was aware that tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions, and the next steps in a test of character, authority, and justice. He was ready to face them, grounded in principle and guided by experience, fully aware that this moment would mark the beginning of a series of events that could define the balance of power, integrity, and accountability in ways he could not yet foresee.